With the NHL season over and the NHL's first buyout period now officially open, today we're looking at another list of players who could find themselves bought out in the near future. We'll jump into that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. As I mentioned, today we're looking at another list here of NHL buyout candidates. Now, of course, this is our second video talking about this type of topic. There was a part 1. We'll call this one part 2. In case you missed it, part 1, we already covered a certain group of players. I will link it up here in the YouTube cards. But just to give you a very quick summary before we jump into the additional buyout candidates I wanted to talk about here today. We talked about guys like Tony DeAngelo. We talked about guys like Keith Yandel, James Neal, Eric Johnson, Martin Jones, Zach Parise, Jake Virtanen, Sonny Milano, Paul Byron of the Montreal Canadiens. Now, we haven't had any buyouts yet, and the main reason for that, in my opinion, is because teams are waiting for the expansion draft. I don't really see there being any buyouts before that time. I mean, it is possible, but if you have a player on your team and roster that you would like to move on from and you're considering a buyout, at this point, why wouldn't you, if possible, put them on your exposure list to make them available to the Seattle Kraken, just on the off chance that they get taken in the expansion draft? Why not? That way you can have it. That way you can move on from the contract free and clear and not have to worry about doing a buyout. So obviously I don't expect any or many of these players to really be considered for that. Now, just a quick reminder as well, part 1 that we talked about with those other players as buyout candidates was actually based on an article by Frank Saravalli, who's now working for dailyfaceoff.com. This is strictly my own opinion of players that I feel will be additional candidates. Obviously, I did agree and disagree with some of the players on that previous list, and we went through my full thoughts on that in the other video. So, getting into today's list, I want to first look at Loui Eriksson of the Vancouver Canucks. I found it a little bit surprising that Loui was not on Saravalli's list. Considering how bad that contract has been for Vancouver for so long. The Canucks have a couple of mega contracts that they're working on with Pettersson and Hughes, really key RFAs, and they need all the cap space that they can get right now. So Loui Eriksson is making $6 million. If they bury him in the minors, which is a possibility, if they don't do a buyout and something they've done in the past, they only get just over $1 million relief. So there's still almost $5 million that counts against their cap in that regard, and it really doesn't help a whole heck of a lot. Now, unfortunately, the way Eriksson's contract is structured, which is a lot of the guys that were signed as free agents in 2016 are all similar type deals, they're not going to save as much as you would think, but they will save more than just burying him in the minors. They would actually save $2 million. But the downfall here is that they tack on an extra year of $1 million. So they'd save $2 million for the upcoming season and then have $1 million of dead cap space a year after. Not ideal, but right now they're in a situation where they need every cent they can get. If their overall situation is determined that extra $1 million in space by buying him out is something that is really worthwhile doing, then I expect them to proceed with that. Now, we also talked, like I said on the other video, about Jake Virtanen being a buyout candidate. I do see that being a pretty likely scenario as well. It's unfortunate the way a lot of these old contracts that were done in 2016 were all structured between the signing bonuses and the salary, so that they were pretty close to being buyout proof, and the only way you'd really consider it would be in the final year. Now, there's some other guys on unfavorable contracts you're not going to find on my list here today, mainly due to the similar scenario. We're talking about guys like Andrew Ladd, Kyle Okposo, and Milan Lucic in Calgary, and they are all contracts that were done the same free agent year, pretty much all on the same day, and they're all structured the same way. Now, those other teams are in a better spots to deal with it, and they're actually structured even worse than this Eriksson one. Like the Andrew Ladd one, the Islanders need the space probably more than anybody in those other three scenarios. Like the Sabres aren't in too bad a shape, and Calgary's, so-so, but the Islanders really need the space. But the way that structure on that contract for Andrew Ladd is there would be almost no savings, and it's not worth it. At least with Loui Eriksson, they saved $2 million in Vancouver, so I do think that's a good possibility. They've been trying to move on from this for a while. I know his agent as well has been working with the Canucks for the last year or two to try to find a solution, and it's been pretty tough. So we'll see, but I highly doubt Louis back in Vancouver next year. Now, last time we talked about James Neal of the Oilers, but there is a couple additional Oilers players who I think are candidates. I don't see the Oilers buying out all 2 or 3 of these players, but I do think at least one will be bought out, and they might be able to find a trade for another. So it just kind of depends on what happens here. I know they've been talking trade with the Hawks about Duncan Keith. Maybe they can convince Chicago to take one of these contracts back to move on from them and buy out at least one more to kind of create a little additional space. But goalie Mikko Koskinen is highly expected to not be back with the Oilers next year. He still has 1 year left at $4.5 million. Buying him out would give them an additional $3 million in cap space for the coming year, but then it would add some dead space the year after at 1.5. But they're in a situation as well that they really need to improve this hockey club, and they need all the cap space they can get. They can't put him out there again for another season. I'm not really sure how they handle this, but a buyout seems pretty likely to me. Now, his teammate, Kyle Turris, to me is also a potential candidate here. Now, the Turris contract's a lot smaller and a lot easier to deal with if they do end up keeping him on board. He's only making $1.65 million, so even if they don't do a buyout and they bury him in the minors, at least they can get $1 million or so relief in that regard. But if they do a buyout instead, they would actually get a fair bit of savings. Get 1.4 of that 1.65 back on their cap this year, but then they would have some dead cap space the year after at $733,000. So it's certainly something they can consider if they're desperate. But I think it's a little less likely we see a Turris buyout compared to Koskinen, or we talked about James Neal in the other video. But in the case of Turris, like I said, at least they have the option to bury it in the minors and get some relief that way. And it's not quite as much, but then they don't have the dead space the year after. So I think Turris is a little bit less likely than the other two, but the option certainly could be considered. Now, before we continue on this list, I do want to pause for a moment and acknowledge one of our channel sponsors, The Ultimate Fan. Are you the ultimate hockey fan looking for the ultimate accessory for your man cave, your fan cave, your she shed, your sports bar, or wherever you enjoy watching sports? This is the ultimate cool NHL licensed accessory that you might want to check out.
Stay cool while cheering on your favorite NHL team with your own customized Ultimate Hockey ceiling fan. Choose from home, away, third jersey, wood, and vintage blade themes. Then select from 2 hockey-like fixture designs, our puck that illuminates your favorite team logo, or our 3D goalie mats. The Ultimate Hockey Fan looks great in any kids' room, she shed, man cave, or sports bar. Not only do our fans cool your room, they make your room look cool. Order your custom fan today at ultimatehockeyfans.com.
Thanks very much for checking out that ad. I do appreciate it. And there will be a link in the description as well as the pinned comment below if you want to go on to the website and consider making a purchase. Now, jumping back into today's content. That takes us to Franzen of the Detroit Red Wings, who has 1 year left at $5.25. Now, the Red Wings are not in a predicament here where they desperately need the cap space, so this may not be something that actually gets done. But we've seen them do this with other long-time contracts that have been on the books that have been anxious to kind of move on from, like Justin Applicator is a good example. So they only would save $1 million in cap space. The way Nielsen's contract is structured, it doesn't offer a ton of savings for the final year of the contract, and there would be $500K of dead space added on for the second year that they would have to stretch it out over, which isn't really a lot. And for a team that's going through a rebuild and not desperate for cap space, it's one of those things that you could bury them in the minors. You don't really need to buy them out, but at the same time, you probably could use that roster spot and put it to better use. So there is that to consider. $1 million savings in a pandemic is not something to scoff at. And at the same time, it's only $500K in dead space the year after. So to me, I think it's a decent possibility, but where they're not a team that's really desperate for space, it's a little bit less likely here. Another player on the Red Wings that can be considered for this as well would be defenseman Danny DeKeyser, who still has 1 year left at $5.5 million. DeKeyser's a player Detroit has tried to move for about 2 years and has not been able to. A combination of reasons between the contract, performance, you chuck it all up to be a fairly, not so good contract that nobody really wants to get their hands on. Now, they would actually save a fair bit by considering doing a buyout this year. They would save $3 million this coming season in actual cap space, and then they would have dead space of 1.5 the year after. So it's a good value, really, if you consider how things are structured here. But at the same time, again, they're not in desperate need, so they don't have to do that. So I guess we'll see here what Yzerman decides to do. But, he's been weaponizing his cap space, trying to take advantage of other teams. So, there's going to be a lot of juggling going around for Yzerman. They may want to move on from some of their bad contracts to take on some other ones that might not not be considered quite as bad, but to get additional assets that can help them get out of the rebuild here over the next few years. So I do expect the Kaiser and Nielsen to be heavily considered by Steve Yzerman in Detroit. Except they're not in a hard spot, so no guarantee it happens, but certainly worth exploring and making into consideration. Next up, we have Capitals defenseman Nick Jensen. Now, Jensen's another guy that's been attempted to be traded here off and on for the past year or two with no luck. He has 2 years left, $2.5 million per season, and they would actually get decent savings, but where it's a 2-year contract remaining, of course, it would be stretched out over 4 years. They would have savings of 1.75 coming up for the coming year and then 1.25 the year after. 2 years of dead cap space of $750K. Now, of course, the Capitals have to re-sign Ovechkin. He's going to want more money. They're in a fairly tight cap situation, trying to remain competitive and relevant while they have some of their older core guys still playing at a pretty good level, like Carlson and Backstrom and Ovechkin and etc. They're rumored to possibly trade Kuznetsov if they can find the deal for him. So that would certainly help their cap situation, of course, depending on what comes back. So I do think that this is something they will consider because they are a team that doesn't have a ton of wiggle room, and trying to be as competitive as possible around these older core players only makes sense to consider what you can to free up some space here. Next up, we have the Chicago Blackhawks and forward Brett Connolly, who they took off the hands of the Florida Panthers earlier this year at the deadline. He still has 2 years left on his contract. He's making $3.5 million, and a buyout would save the Hawks $2.3 million each of the next 2 seasons. So that's a pretty decent savings. Now, the Hawks are not a team that's desperate need here as well. They do have some LTIR room here with contracts like Brent Seabrook, for example, guys we know are not going to play. So they're not as tight up against it as some other teams because of that. So this isn't a move they absolutely have to make, but Connolly's a player who has not played well for some time. The contract he signed after leaving the Capitals as a free agent has not aged well. Obviously, the Panthers were looking to move on and get him over to Chicago, and now I'm not entirely convinced Chicago plans to keep him around here for the next 2 years either. So we'll have to see how things go, but I would not be shocked to see a Brett Connolly buyout happen in Chicago. Now, another player I kind of briefly talked about in the other video in part 1 was Jake Gardiner of the Carolina Hurricanes. Of course, Gardner was not on Sarah Valley's list, but a player I think is a real strong possibility for a buyout. Dundon certainly has a reputation of not wasting money, not wanting to overpay. I don't think he's fond of paying anybody to not work for them. So we'll see what happens, but Gardner does have 2 years left at just over $4 million, and he's not been a regular player for them. He's been a spare part, but at the same time, they're in a situation here where they might lose Dougie Hamilton to free agency, which is a real possibility, and they could even lose another defenseman in the expansion draft. So he could become a player that they need to play a little bit more next year, so it might be something that they want to keep around. But if they do decide that the cap space is more important, because they do have some big contracts to look after, like their goaltenders and Nedeljkovic and Mrazek are both needing new deals. Andrei Svechnikov needs a new contract, and he wants a good chunk of change over a long term if possible. They would save $2.7 million for the coming year and $3 million the year after on Gardner in those last 2 years. Of course, they'd have some dead cap space for 2 years after that at 1.4, which is not overly desirable, but at that point, you're hoping the cap is starting to increase a little bit, and you can kind of start to move on from that. But the cap space could come in more handy than having a player on your roster here over the next 2 years. One guy that I think is a possibility as well, but not as likely as some, would be Wild center iceman Victor Rask, who's got 1 year left at $4 million. I think a lot of this is going to be dependent on if they can find other players on the roster here. It's been rumored that they've been looking at Jack Eichel. If they're successful in that regard, this might become more likely, unless he's part of a trade package, of course. But I mean, Victor Rask is not the worst contract in the NHL right now, but he's certainly not one of the best. And it's a situation where if they find another center iceman to come in, like they're rumored to be working on, then he kind of becomes expendable, in my opinion, and that $4 million is not overly great, and it kind of creates a little bit of a cap problem. When you have guys like Kaprizov who wants big money, you got Eriksson just signed to a mega deal, 8 years. Now, it's not too expensive, but still a big raise for him. And then you get Kevin Fiala, who's rumored to be looking at $7 million plus. I mean, we don't know what the contracts are going to work out to for Fiala and Kaprizov, but you know what? They're both going to be paid fairly well, and I do think the Wild are a real possibility here to be one of the teams more active in the trade market, and that might create a situation where they have to make this sort of move. It would save $2.6 million in cap space out of that $4 million to get back, which would come in handy, and of course they'd have $1.3 million in dead space for the year after. So that dead space the year after does pose a little bit of a problem, but I guess if they have to figure things out next year as opposed to this year and possibly, make some other moves, that's something they can maybe deal with. Of course, you get Matt Dumba making $6 million as well, who might be traded or claimed in expansion, and that could also solve issues. So obviously, like I said, a lot of these buyouts are not going to likely happen until after expansion, because that could change the team's outlook and dynamic here, their cap situation, depending on who the Kraken end up selecting. And lastly here, I want to look at Anton Stralman of the Florida Panthers, who's got 1 year left at $5.5 million. Now, I know on Sarah Valley's list was one of the other Panthers defensemen, Keith Yandel, who I think they'd be really wanting to move on from as well. But in the case of Anton Stralman at $5.5 million, he was a guy that was not playing a lot. The Panthers are definitely wanting to move on from him. They'd save $3 million in space next year, which would be a huge help to getting the rest of their roster filled out. And they could have a 1 year additional of dead space at 1.5, which isn't, great, but it's not terrible either. So depending on how desperate teams are for the coming year, will determine how likely these moves are. And obviously, like I said, the expansion draft is going to determine a lot of the course of action here as well. I don't expect to see much ahead of time, and just in case these guys are going to be claimed. But I don't think the Kraken are going to be taking a whole lot in the way of bad contracts. And if they do, it's going to be done through trade with additional sweeteners and assets added into the mix to make it worth their while here. So let me know which players you feel are most likely to be bought out, and let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. We'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news and rumors on all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.